ago, and the name of the movie was Vantage Point. And I never saw the movie myself, but I have been told that the basic premise of the movie is something along the lines of something happened, an event, perhaps a crime or something like that, and it was witnessed by 7 different people, all looking at it from a different perspective. This person was standing here watching it, that person was standing there, somebody was up high looking down and all that sort of stuff. And when they got around to talking with these 7 witnesses, they all gave a slightly different story. Why would that be? A different perspective or a different vantage point. And that's the whole reason for the name of the movie is Vantage Point. The Gospels all tell the same story. But do they? Matthew, Mark, and Luke talk about somebody who walks on water, but John doesn't talk about that. John talks about somebody who met with a Pharisee by the name of Nicodemus at nighttime, but Matthew, Mark, and Luke don't tell us that. In fact, John tells us a lot of things that Matthew, Mark, and Luke don't tell us. John tells us that this same person said, if you abide in me and my words abide in you. He also said he is the vine, they are the branch. He went so far as to call himself living water when he witnessed of all things a woman at a well in Samaria. Is John indeed talking about the same thing Matthew, Mark, and Luke are? How? It's just so wildly different. Different point, not only a different point of view, but what else? Different people and a different purpose. John himself said, I believe it's in chapter 20, he said, these are just some of the things that Jesus said and did. I suppose if we were to write down all the things he said and did, there wouldn't be enough books in the whole world to contain it all. So John collected the events he wanted to share. He selected those events out of all the events that he had, and he put them in his book, in his gospel, in the order he wanted to put them in order to John chapter 20, write these things so that you might believe in the name of the Son of God, and by believing you might have life in his name. This came real to me. This was driven home to me whenever I was in college and I was working in the journalism department, and we were selecting stories for a news broadcast. And I was looking at all of this sort of stuff, and I said, well, good grief, we have so many stories here, we don't have enough time in a 30-minute newscast. And the news director said, well, we choose what's important. And I said, who determines what's important? He says, I do. That's why I'm the news director. And there were some very important things that didn't get told. I think that still happens today. I'm not saying that it is deliberate to make a point the way John makes a point, but it could very well be. Now, why do I bring all that up? I'm glad you asked. Because we're turning our attention to the book of Chronicles, and you'll notice what I've kind of given as a subtitle to the book of Chronicles. Second verse, same as the first. And there's something of a question mark behind all of that. And the reason for that is because in a lot of places you go whenever they're trying to read through the Bible or they're trying to study through the Bible. I don't know how Lifeway does it in the Explore the Bible literature. I don't know how a lot of pastors that are determined and committed to preaching through the Bible in a year are concerned or anything like that. We'll go about it. But a lot of places just don't focus on the book of Chronicles by itself because it is second verse. Same as the first. Almost. So tonight we'll look at the book of Chronicles. We'll get as far as we get, or we'll get done, one or the other, And after this, we'll deal with Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther. And then as far as the history of the Old Testament is concerned, we are largely done. We might look a little bit at the history of what happened after the close of the Old Testament up to the opening of the New Testament. But after that, then we have the books of poetry and have the books of prophecy. When we're looking at all this, we have the same questions that we like to ask with a lot of the books we study, and it's kind of hard to answer some of these questions when it comes to the book of Chronicles. One of the things we do is we ask the question, who wrote it? Well, who wrote Galatians? Paul. Who wrote Ephesians? Paul. How do we know? It says so. Galatians 1:1, I, Paul. Ephesians 1:1, I, Paul. Whenever we come to the book of Chronicles, there is no name attached to it. We don't have any idea. The one possibility, the majority opinion until recently has been Ezra from the book of Ezra. Beyond that, we don't know. We really don't know. Most Old Testament books before the book of Psalms do not have an author of any kind. They are not named for their authors. They are named for primary characters, or they're named for, if there's multiple primary characters, then it's named for the first primary character. Kings, all those kings. Samuel is the first primary character. That sort of thing. We don't know who wrote them. When it comes to the book of Chronicles, it is because this is a chronicle of the events of the life of the nation of Israel. Whoever the author was, and until recently many people thought it was Ezra, and it could very well still have been Ezra, whoever he was, he must have been a historian, theologian, and a pastor. He must have been a historian because he is delving into retelling the story to a certain extent of everything that's happened. And so he has done his research, he's done his reading, he knows all the other books that he can look at and all that other sort of stuff. So he is trying to put it together. Like John, he's writing for a specific purpose, because John tells us what that purpose is in John chapter 20. You know, that's kind of, Paul told us the same thing in the book of 1 Corinthians. I'm writing in response to a letter that he received, and he says this frequently, now concerning what you wrote about, now concerning, or a report that he received from Chloe's household. Very topical in nature, and he's telling them why he's writing. Galatians, he tells them why he's writing. I am surprised you have turned so quickly from the gospel, which isn't a gospel at all. And he proceeds to talk about that. This guy, whoever the author was, the chronicler, as he's sometimes called, was a historian. He intended to depict Israel's history, retell Israel's history from Genesis through Kings. He is also a theologian. And the reason why I say that he was also a theologian is because he's very careful to talk about how God is behind everything, and God is in everything, and God is in control. He's something of a pastor because he's trying to persuade the people to stay true to God. Who he is, we don't know. So, chronicler. When was it written? We don't know. Why are we talking about all this? Because when it was written, we might have a little more information about it. There seems to be something of a significant literary tie between Chronicles and Ezra and Nehemiah. And so if you turn to 2 Chronicles chapter 36, and depending on where 2 Chronicles appears on the pages in your Bible, and where Ezra begins, in a lot of Bibles, they're on facing pages. Okay? a lot of times 2 Chronicles 36 and Ezra chapter 1 are on facing pages. So you can look at 2 Chronicles 36 on like the left-hand page, and Ezra 1 starts on the right-hand page. 2 Chronicles chapter 36, verse 22. In the first year of Cyrus, king of Persia, that the word of the Lord by the mouth of Jeremiah might be fulfilled, the Lord stirred up the spirit of Cyrus, king of Persia, so that he made a proclamation throughout all his kingdom. And he put it in writing. Thus says Cyrus, king of Persia, the Lord, the God of heaven, has given me all the kingdoms of the earth, and he has charged me to build him a house at Jerusalem, which is in Judah. Whoever is among you of all his people, may the Lord his God be with him. Let him go up. That's how 2 Chronicles ends. How does Ezra begin? And thus says Cyrus, king of Persia. It is, with maybe only a word here or there, the last, however many, 2 verses of 2 Chronicles and the first 3 verses of Ezra chapter 1 are basically word for word identical. There's a little bit of variation. Of course, whoever it was that split all this up into verses 800,000 years ago did Ezra chapter 1 and 3 verses, and 2 Chronicles 36 is in only 2 verses. But the idea is the same. So there's 2 options here. The same author wrote both of them. What do you have when you have a 2-part television show? How does the second part start? Well, the first part ends to be continued, and how does the second part start? Of what happened. And so a lot of people say, well, it was the same author that wrote both Chronicles and Ezra and Nehemiah, and he is deliberately tying them together by the use of this word, this decree that Cyrus gave. The second option is somebody else wrote Ezra and Nehemiah all together, and he tried to tie it into Chronicles. And honestly, we have looked at the history of Genesis through Kings, and starting with Chronicles, there is a continuous historical flow from Chronicles all the way through the end of Nehemiah. And so, if the last event in Chronicles is Cyrus letting the Judeans return to Judah, and that happened in 537 BC, and for the author to be able to write about it, it had to be after 537 BC. The last event in Ezra and Nehemiah is a recommitment to the covenant under Nehemiah, which was around 450 BC. If the same author that wrote Chronicles wrote Ezra and Nehemiah, then the author of Chronicles had to be after 450 BC. At any rate, the author of Chronicles is coming back after the exile because he already knows of the exile and he already knows of Cyrus letting them return. So several years have passed since the final destruction of Jerusalem. At least 50 years have passed since the final destruction of Jerusalem. Why? That was who? We don't know who wrote it. When was it written? As early as 537 BC, perhaps as after 450 BC. Why was it written? Basically, it retells everything that happened Genesis through 2 Kings, but with a different vantage point. Again, the 4 Gospels that tell the story of Christ's life, but from slightly different perspectives. Chronicles retells the history of Israel from a slightly different perspective. The question then becomes, why did they feel the need to do it from a slightly different perspective? And that's really what occupies most of our time as we're looking at the book of Chronicles and trying to figure it all out. Why would anybody want to retell the story if it's already written down?
That's the better part. The book of Kings was like people moving away from God a lot, and the book of Chronicles, which is mostly using David, then they're telling you in the Chronicles about how to get back to God in a way.
Okay.
Bringing the people back to God.
It's written differently for that purpose, and to come back to God or to stay true to God, perhaps. Why would they need to hear all of that stuff again if he was just wanting to make sure that they're true to God or they're coming back to God? Yeah. There are three different perspectives in trying to answer that question. From a historical perspective, there's a little bit of information in Chronicles that wasn't there, but not a whole lot. Israel already knew her history. The people knew their history. But if he's writing after the exile, he is one of those who has come back from exile. Because remember, they took all the sharpest, the brightest, the most brilliant into exile and just left the poor and the not so sharp and not so bright in the land, or what they thought was not so sharp and not so bright. If the Jewish faith prospered and flourished in any way, it would have been in exile. That's why what Jeremiah told them, go into exile. It will be good for you. But they didn't listen to him. That's why he said, Jeremiah told them to go with Nebuchadnezzar. But you don't know what you're talking about, Jeremiah. We're staying where we are. It was a mistake. They should have agreed and gone on with them. So life had been hard for them. And the chronicler is telling people, remember all that stuff that happened? Well, he's still on the throne, and now we're back. Let me show you how all of this works together. And so he proceeds to talk about the United Kingdom, David and Solomon. And when after the divided kingdom, he doesn't talk about Israel very much unless they somehow or another fit into the story of the kings of Judah. The good kings of Judah are described in length. Attributes highlighted, shortcomings not mentioned. We have more unique information in the book of Chronicles about Hezekiah than we do in total all information about Hezekiah in the book of Kings. There's that much stuff about Hezekiah because of how good Hezekiah was. His focus, the chronicler's focus, is on all the good kings of Israel. And he goes on and on and on and on in detail about talking about these good kings. He talks a little bit about bad kings and then shuts it off and he moves on. Hezekiah has a lot of space. David has a lot of space. Josiah has a lot of space. In just a moment, I'll show you that some of the shortcomings of the good kings that Kings was so, and Samuel and Kings was so free to mention, don't appear in the book of Chronicles. For example, second bullet point, we read of David and all the positive things we did, but guess what's missing from Chronicles? The whole thing with Bathsheba. We read in Kings about Solomon and all that Solomon did. What is never mentioned? His numerous wives and subsequent idolatry. Once again, God is on the throne. God is at work. God gave us David. And this was David and how David was good for us. And then after David was gone, he gave us Solomon. And this was Solomon and how Solomon was good for us. And then after Solomon, there were some people who made some pretty poor choices. But boom, here comes Hezekiah. And God was with Hezekiah, and Hezekiah was right with God, and Hezekiah did all this incredible stuff. That's sort of the storyline as you're reading through the book of Chronicles. Asa is mentioned. He is uniformly and thoroughly evil in 2 Kings. He reigned for 55 years in 2 Kings. There is nothing good to say about Manasseh in 2 Kings. Look at 2 Chronicles 33, verse 9. This is talking about Manasseh, the 55-year-long evil ruling king. 2 Chronicles chapter 33, verse 9. Manasseh led Judah and the inhabitants of Jerusalem astray. What did he lead them to do according to verse 9? Yeah. More evil than the nations whom the Lord destroyed before Israel. All the ites, the Canaanites, the Perizzites, the Girgashites, the Hittites, the Jebusites, all those ites. He led them to do more evil than all that. That's pretty much what the book of Kings says. But now look at verse 10. The Lord spoke to Manasseh and to his people, and they paid no attention. Well, that makes a certain amount of sense. And then boom, out of nowhere, verse 12, when Manasseh was in distress, he entreated the favor of the Lord his God and humbled himself greatly before the God of his fathers. He prayed to him, and God was moved by his entreaty and heard his plea and brought him again to Jerusalem into his kingdom. And then Manasseh knew that the Lord was God. Somehow or another, all of that is missing in the book of Kings. Here the chronicler throws it in. Why? Manasseh turned to God and God delivered him. It's reinforcing the chronicler's message. I read from chapter 21 just a moment ago as we got started about Jehoram, and he was 32 years old and he reigned for 8 years. It's just pretty gruesome, but here's the chronicler's take on everything, starting in 2 Chronicles chapter 21, verse 18. After all that Jehoram did, the Lord struck him in his bowels with an incurable disease. In the course of time, at the end of 2 years, his bowels came out because of the disease, and he died in great agony. I would think so. His people made no fire in his honor, like the fires made for his fathers. He was 32 years old when he began to reign. He reigned 8 years, and when he departed, no one missed him. He departed with no one's regret. From a historical perspective, evil kings were, to borrow a phrase from the New Testament, kicking against the goad. And good kings were all that was to be treasured. Well, that's the historical perspective of why he writes the way he does. There's also something of a political perspective built into all of this. And not, let me work. The northern kingdom was never faithful to Yahweh, was it? How many bad kings did the northern kingdom have? A bunch. How many total kings did they have? Same number. Every single king in the northern kingdom was a bad king. They were destroyed at the hands of Shalmaneser in 722 BC, and according to the chronicler, that was final. The northern kingdom was gone. They never came back. Judah remained. Why did Judah remain? Because they were faithful to Yahweh. There would be no revival of the northern kingdom. The southern kingdom of Judah was blessed of God, and the southern kingdom of Judah would continue. Now, perhaps a more important perspective, the theological perspective. Historically, he showed his stuff, we see what the chronicler was doing. Politically, we see that. Theological, as Matthew, Mark, Luke, John picked, chose, and wrote in a particular way, so did our chronicler. His goal, recovery of the glory days of David and Solomon, the golden age of Israel. And that would only be achieved through adherence to Yahweh and His Word and a restoration of authentic temple worship. The glory days of David, Solomon, not in a political sense, but a return to obedience, a return to worship. Righteousness exalts a nation. Individually, judgment and reward are based on actions. He even gives us a moral reason for Saul's death. And so, the books he quotes are not merely referred to, they're show God's will. The temple, its worship, its officials, important. David's designs, Hezekiah's reforms shine forth. In the end, the book is a reminder that the exile occurred. Why? Because of disobedience to and a lack of proper worship of Yahweh. Go back. All these people, the promise had been made. They had land. They had Jerusalem. They had the temple. They were the center of the worship of the one and only true God that existed. We got it made. We're pretty good. They fell into idolatry. God sent them prophets to warn them. They didn't listen. They persisted in idolatry and other forms of evil associated with that. He sent them more prophets. They still did not listen. And finally he said, I promised you this land as long as you obeyed me. Where is the obedience now? And so he sent them off into exile. He got their attention. And so when we turn to the book of Chronicles, the chronicler wrote this in such a way as to show that obedience to God is a good thing. Ignore all that other stuff. It's not that it didn't happen, but that just brought them down. When did they flourish? When they obeyed God. When did they flourish? When temple worship was like it was supposed to be. So, from a historical perspective, from a political perspective, from a theological perspective, he is saying, don't repeat what we did before we went into exile unless you want to go into exile again. Why did the Pharisees, why were they so meticulous in keeping the law in the New Testament? I'm jumping from one testament to another, but there's a connection here. Well, perhaps tradition, part of it. I think it was more than just tradition. I mean, they were rigidly legalistic, if you will. Why? They didn't want to get in trouble again. They were doing the same thing, just in a different manner that the person who wrote Chronicles is doing. Go back there. Now, why are churches legalistic today? I'm sorry? Fear of what? Fear of punishment. Fear of losing their spot. Not having done what's necessary to work their way into heaven. How bad do things have to get to scare somebody that much? Memory problem. Short-term memory loss. Long-term memory loss. Yeah. And so much of what we see in the book of Chronicles is whoever wrote the book of Chronicles attempt to be faithful to the history of Israel, but to write it in such a way as to say, don't go back. Don't do that again. We saw where all that led us one time. No. Don't go there. Don't go there. Well, there are some concerns that some have in looking at the books of Genesis through Kings and looking at Chronicles, and they'll say, oh, they don't say the same thing. Oh, there's a disagreement and stuff. And you kind of wonder if perhaps some people are sweating the details. 2 Samuel 24:9 and 1 Chronicles 21:5 both talk about the collective armies of Israel and Judah, but they give two different sets of numbers. One right is one wrong. David took an ill-advised census. 2 Samuel 24:1 gives one motivation for it. 1 Chronicles 21:1 gives a second motivation for it. What was the correct motivation? How long passed after the Exodus before the construction of the temple? Kings calls it 480 years, and Chronicles just calls it 12 generations. Which one was it? 480 years or 12 generations? Andrew Hill said this: the Hebrew chronicler is not a historian in our strict Western sense. We have to have absolute precision, and everything has to correlate exactly with computer-esque precision. To him, Israel's history was pregnant with spiritual and moral lessons. He is not concerned so much with the bare facts of Israel's history as with their meaning. If all valid historical writing is interpretive, then the chroniclers is highly so. We can look back at these three things and say, well, from a biblical perspective, a generation is normally 40 years, and 12 times 40 is 480, so maybe they're saying the same thing. 2 Samuel 24:1 said that God incited David to take a census, but 1 Chronicles says Satan did it. We can't reconcile those two things except to realize that when Samuel was written, the idea of Satan being alive and well on planet Earth was not part of the Hebrew theological mindset as it was when Chronicles was written. And they started to realize that God wasn't necessarily behind all bad. Satan was out there. Satan was responsible for that as well. So I look at all this and I say, are you looking for something wrong? If you are, then you're going to find it every time. You know, why does one gospel say there were two angels in the empty tomb and another gospel say there was only one angel? The two, was there one? Well, there's a good probability there was two, but the gospel said there was only one, was there was only one that talked. So here we go. Genealogies from Adam to David, 1 Chronicles, chapters 1 through 9. Oh, it's gripping reading, folks. The reign of Saul, one chapter. Chapter 10 only. The reign of David, he gets 19 chapters. All the way from 1 Chronicles chapter 11 through 1 Chronicles chapter 29. Solomon's only 9 chapters long, but he was only 9 chapters in 2 Kings as well. And then the reign of David's sons from Solomon through the exile, 2 Chronicles chapters 10 through 36. When we look at the genealogies, look at 1 Chronicles chapter 1. Go back to, all the way back to 1 Chronicles. Here is 1 Chronicles chapter 1, verses 1 through... Are you ready? Adam, Seth, Enosh, Kenan, Mahalalel, Jared, Enoch, Methuselah, Lamech, Noah, Shem, Ham, Japheth. You go from Adam to Japheth in 4 verses. There's not a single begat in there. You drop down to verse 32, the sons of Keturah, Abraham's concubine, she bore, and now you have something resembling the word begat when you get down to verse 32. And then in verse 34, Abraham fathered Isaac, and that is similar to the term begat. And as you kind of look through all of this, you have all the genealogy from Abraham to Jacob, starting in around verse 28 of chapter 1. And then as you're getting down to about the time that you're going to run into Jacob, you suddenly run into the sons of Esau. And then you run into the sons of Seir. And then you run into the kings in the land of Edom. And it's still just listing everybody by name. Then you have the genealogy of David and his descendants. And you think, okay, well, we're moving along. We're getting along pretty good. You finish chapter 3 with the descendants of David. And chapter 4 takes you all the way back to Judah in the book of Genesis. And then Simeon and Reuben and Gad and the half-tribe of Manasseh and Levi. And if you notice something, where does the listing of the half-tribe of Manasseh start? Chapter 5, verse 23. Where does it end? Chapter 5, verse 26. He gets 4 verses. Gad got 12 verses. Reuben got 10 verses. Levi, chapter 6, verse 1 through chapter 6, verse 81. Why does he devote 81 verses to Levi, the descendants, where they live, and all that sort of stuff? Because the priests were faithful to Yahweh. Issachar, look at that, Naphtali, the descendants of Naphtali, chapter 7, verse 13. And that's it. Jaziel, Guni, Jazer, Shalom, the descendants of Bilhah. That's it. Manasseh, Ephraim, Asher. We have a genealogy of Saul in chapter 8. And then we have the returned exiles in chapter 9 before he talks about Saul. Why have all of this genealogy? Not a single begat in there. Not something close to that in verse 32. Something close to that in verse 34. Who was the audience? People who came back from exile. And all of a sudden, they know their history. They know who Adam was. They know who Abraham was. They know who David was. Hey, and they're part of it. Part of the big picture. God is still at work even today in the lives of those people who come back from exile. Abraham mattered. They mattered. Abraham was part of God's plan. They are part of God's plan. The reign of David is the heart of the story because David was the cream of the crop. He was as good as you get. You can't get no better. If there was a perfect example, if there was a gold medal winner, it was a gold medal winner for being like David. Something along those lines. And as we read through the reign of David in the second half of 1 Chronicles, it reads a lot like 1 and 2 Samuel, but there's some noticeable things that are missing there. For example, Samuel anointing him as king is missing. For example, David's long struggle with Saul is missing. For example, David's weakness with Bathsheba is missing. Look at how it starts. In 1 Chronicles chapter 10, verse 13, Saul died. Why? For his unfaithfulness. He broke faith with the Lord in that he did not keep the command of the Lord. He consulted a medium seeking guidance. He did not seek guidance from the Lord. Therefore the Lord put him to death and turned the kingdom over to David. And all Israel gathered together to David at Hebron and said, hey, you're king. There is no Samuel. Struggle, which lasted for however many years. That's not in there. What is he saying? David loved the Lord God with all his heart. All kings should love God with all his heart. Remember how good it was with David when he loved the Lord God with all his heart? We need to love the Lord God with all our heart. And of Solomon, Kings speaks of what? His wisdom, his wealth, and his women. How many? A few too many. A few hundred too many. Solomon is given wisdom and wealth in chapter 1. It's displayed in chapter 9, and there's no mention of wives, concubines, or idolatry. There's no mention of any of Solomon's weaknesses. And if you look at it, the heart of the narrative, chapters 2 through 7, is the building and the dedication of the temple. Why was David so good? Because he loved the Lord God. Why was Solomon so good? Solomon built the temple. After Solomon's death, he's concerned with Judah. They are the new, quote-unquote, chosen people, if you will, because Israel is gone. Israel forsook God, so they no longer count. As we get to the end of 2 Kings, chapter 25, verses 1 through 21, we read about Nebuchadnezzar's third trip to Jerusalem and his destruction of the city of Jerusalem and his taking more people off into exile in 587 BC. This same event, exile under Nebuchadnezzar in 587, occurs in 2 Chronicles 36. Then, in 2 Kings 25, it talks about Jehoiachin being released by Evil-Merodach in 561. This occurs also in Jeremiah 52. It does not occur in Chronicles. Instead, Chronicles doesn't go from 587 to 561. Chronicles goes from 587 to roughly 538 at the very end of it all. Cyrus releases Judean prisoners to return to Judea. And so we come to the end of Chronicles, sort of. Sort of. There's an interesting historical marker right at the very end of 2 Chronicles. And different people make different things of this. It's going to be in 2 Chronicles chapter 36, and it's going to be like verses 20 and 21. The passage reads thus: He took into exile in Babylon those who had escaped from the sword. Okay, this is talking about Nebuchadnezzar. That's the he. And they became servants to him and his sons until the establishment of the kingdom of Persia. That's about as much as we hear about the big fight between Babylon and Persia. That's all it. In order to fulfill the word of the Lord by the mouth of Jeremiah, until the land had enjoyed its Sabbaths, all the days that it lay desolate, it kept Sabbath to fulfill 70 years. Exile to the return under first exile by Nebuchadnezzar to the return under Cyrus was roughly 70 years, 605 BC to 538. And so that's the 70 years most people look at this. However, on the other hand, land enjoyed its Sabbaths. Sabbath rest was every 7 years, once every 7 years. It had 70 years of Sabbath rest. 70 times 7. 490 years. From the time that David began his reign until roughly the time that the land was destroyed and they were sent off into exile was 490 years. It is almost as if he is saying the golden age of the nation was the Sabbath rest for the land. Because the Sabbath rest only comes when you're obedient to God. You know, I'd never heard all of this before, but it is interesting to stop and to think about. Anyway, 2 Chronicles begins with Adam and it ends with Cyrus. It begins before time was marked to 538 BC. How many thousands of years have passed? I have no way of knowing. But he's making a point over and over and over and over again. They messed up because they didn't obey God. There are things in the book of Chronicles. David actually organized the Levites into groups, and each group was responsible for something different. Some were responsible for gatekeepers, some were responsible for leading the singing and all that other sort of stuff. That's all appears in the book of Chronicles. Stuff we didn't talk about. But that's Chronicles. And it ends with Cyrus coming into power. And we see that Ezra and Nehemiah begins with Cyrus coming into power. Comments? Questions? I went looking for books on 2nd Chronicles. They're hard to come by. They're hard to come by. Everybody wants to focus on everything through Kings and then just jump over Chronicles to Ezra. I don't know that I've ever heard a sermon on Chronicles unless it deals with Solomon's dedication of the temple, because probably the most famous verse in all of Chronicles is 2 Chronicles 7:15. If my people who are called by my name will humble themselves and pray, I will hear from heaven, turn and heal their land. That's the essence of Chronicles. If my people who are called by my name will turn and pray. I'm done unless you got questions, comments, etc., etc., etc.